Welcome to Newton Fellowship Church. My name is Colin Vandiker. I'm the lead pastor of Newton Fellowship. I'm glad you're joining us this morning under difficult circumstances or different circumstances. I thought that we would be gathered in our church facility, meeting with our groups of 50 at our 3 different services and online streaming. But then yesterday happened. Bonnie Henry made an announcement that the province of BC is requesting or asking that there would not be gatherings larger than your immediate family. And it talked about social gatherings. So I received alerts from many of you from the church saying, what's going to take place for church? I talked to the board and a couple members from the board, and we decided that we were going to cancel services in light of that direction. Now, subsequent, we have heard that we could have met, and so for some of us, this could be unfortunate that we're meeting this way, but I think this is a good, safe practice. We've done this before, and just stay tuned about what's going to happen next week. If we continue our normal schedule, which we probably will. But anyway, I trust that in spite of our distance, that you would come join us at 11:30 this morning on Zoom. I've already sent out the link, and so that we can have communion together and we can be worshipers together, no matter what the circumstances. We are to gather together. We are to pray for one another. We're to pray for our province. And once again, we just find ourselves in very unique times as we try and navigate this. And so we're doing the best that we can. Now this morning, I want to turn your attention to 1 Samuel, and we're going to be exploring an incredible story about how the first king of Israel was raised up. If you recall, we're in a series which I've entitled The Kingmaker, because Samuel was given to Hannah, to Israel, to basically be the initiator of the kingdoms of Israel and to bring safety and prosperity and blessing into the land of Israel. And so up till now, Samuel was the one who was leading and who was guiding and who was leading battles and who was calling the shots and was interpreting God's will for the people. But a couple of weeks ago, we saw that Samuel was getting older. The nation of Israel wanted a king, and even though there was going to be consequences and the king was not going to be perfect, there was going to be a king that was raised up. And today we see the story of this first king being raised up. Now, I think it's important to read stories. Sometimes in church, we leave the stories for the children, for Sunday school, because children have vivid imaginations and because maybe sometimes they don't understand some of the more difficult theological truths that we wrestle with as adults. But sometimes by just spending more time, and we miss, without going back to the stories, how they can impact our hearts and describe to us the reality of what God sees and what we should see in this world as well. Stories inspire us, they speak to us at an emotional level, and they just give us a picture of the world, a window into the world, perhaps the way that it should look like, or it could look like. We can't obviously apply all stories to our situation, but we can, for instance, maybe it's love stories, maybe it's stories of war and courage that you would read, a movie that you would watch that would inspire you. And you know that story isn't about you, but somehow it is. It's about this human condition. It's about the way that we long for this world to work. And so too is this true story message about how God raises up the first king of Israel. And it begins in 1 Samuel chapter 9, and we begin in verse 1. And it says these words: "There was a Benjamite, a man of standing, or potentially a man of valor, both things, a mighty man, whose name was Kish, son of Abiel, the son of Zerorah, the son of Bechorath, the son of Abiah and Benjamin. He had a son named Saul, an impressive young man without equal among the Israelites, a head taller than all of the others." Now, when we read these first verses, you probably are attracted to the very end, when it says kings, this man by the name of Saul was impressive. He was a young man, probably at this point 25 or so, maybe 27, 28 years old. So when it says young man, it wasn't like he was a child or a 12-year-old. He ended up, spoiler alert, became king at age 30. And so the description of what's going to take place, he must have been very close to 30 at this particular time. Young man. And it says that was without equal, impressive in appearance, a head taller than all of the others. And so he's the type of guy like a young Thor, if you will, a big, buff, young, good-looking man that should have been almost the heartthrob of Israel, should have attracted so much attention. But he didn't, not until this time. And one of the reasons why is because we probably overlooked some of the key details about his background. First of all, it says he was a Benjamite. Now, and his father was mighty, and sometimes it's very difficult living in the shadow of a strong man, or you know, if you grow up in a family where whether it's a dad or a mother figure or an uncle or a grandfather that casts this incredible shadow of somebody who is mighty in valor and somebody that everybody respects, sometimes it's hard filling those shoes, even if potentially you could. But that's not the biggest point. The biggest point is that he was a Benjamite. Now, Benjamin is one of the tribes of Israel. They were known for a lot of different things. They actually were known for being a tribe that had more left-handed people than anybody else. In fact, they had a whole division in their force that was all made up of left-handed individuals. So some of you who are left-handed can say, "Wow, that's kind of cool." The Bible doesn't talk about too many left-handed individuals. On top of that, they were mighty people. They had courage. They were warriors, they were fighters. In fact, they were often the guys who sometimes went first into battle because the Benjamites were the most fierce, which is kind of interesting. The other thing you need to know is that about 2 or 3, maybe 4 generations before Saul was born, the Benjamites were almost wiped out as a tribe because of their sinfulness and their selfishness. It's one of the most tragic stories at the very end of the book of Judges, and you can go and read that. I'm not going to go through all of the gory details, but probably one of the most horrific stories in all of Scripture about how the Gibeonites had lost their moral footing, performed acts that were awful. And in so doing, the nation of Israel said, this has to stop. And the Gibeonites, because they were part of the Benjamites, instead of giving up the Gibeonites and agreeing with all of Israel that these people were living outside of God's standing, the Benjamites, maybe out of loyalty or out of their own sinfulness, said, we're going to side with our family members, the Gibeonites, no matter what God says. And there was a civil war that took place. In that civil war between all of Israel and Benjamin, there were 3 great battles. In the first 2 battles, the one tribe of Benjamin defeated the rest of the nation of Israel, and many died. And in the final battle, finally God says, I'm going to give Israel the victory. And of the 26,000 plus men from Benjamin who went into battle, 25,000 died, which leaves 1,000 approximately left over. And if these were the mighty, vigorous young men of Benjamin, of this entire tribe, it means that the entire nation was decimated due to their sinfulness and their selfishness. And 2 to 3 generations later, Benjamin would have been the least of the tribes of Israel by a long shot, where the others had many young men. The Benjamites lost 80% of their men, maybe even more, maybe even higher. In the midst of their fierceness, in the midst of their strength, in the midst of even having men like Kish that are still being risen up, who are valorous and strong, in the midst of having a young man like the man of Saul, this is by far the least of the tribes. And of the least of the tribes, it has such a negative context of great sin of great selfish, of great wickedness that would have been cast over the entire nation, weighing it down, and not the nation, but of the people of the Benjamites, that was just oppressing them. For they had failed, and they had been sinful, and they had been judged. They had been judged. Now we move on. It says, the donkeys belonging to Saul's father, Kish, were lost. This is verse 3. And Kish said to his son Saul, take one of the servants with you and go and look for the donkeys. So he passed through the hill country of Ephraim, through the land around Cilicia, but they did not find them. And then they went on to the district of Shalem. The donkeys weren't there, and they kept on going throughout Benjamin. They couldn't find the donkeys. Now here's Saul, probably 28, 29 years old, maybe, young man, strong, powerful. He seems to be the type of individual that should be a leader, or should have done something great in his life by now, all of the physical and natural attributes. Yet he still seems to be treated not like a firstborn or one who is destined to reign and rule in his family even. He's treated like a servant. That's the servant's tasks. Our donkeys are gone. Saul, go look for them. Go discover them. He's treated like almost a child or servant, if you will, to go and find the donkeys. I don't know a lot about donkeys and what it's like to find donkeys. My greatest experience with donkeys when I was in Pakistan, and we need to be in prayer for Pastor Anba, who's in Pakistan. Last night he was preaching at one of the churches that he goes and visits. It's a time of convention in Pakistan, so he'll be there for a couple more weeks. But so in Pakistan, you're going down the road, you're going down a highway, and you'll see like a donkey, which is just freaks you out. Donkey pulling a little cart. You're driving 100 kilometers an hour down the highway, and you're got to go around a donkey. It's like, this is crazy, but that's Pakistan. Second thing about donkeys that I know, John and I, my son, went to Guatemala on a missions trip, and it was a fantastic experience of a Christian school, being part of a Christian school, being part of a little neighborhood, and sharing the gospel. And we got to experience a lot of great things, and I think it actually was a really meaningful time for John and I in our relationship, and John in his spiritual life. And one of the experiences we got to have, which, because it wasn't just all ministry, there was some tourism, we got to go to one of the volcanoes. There's lots of volcanoes in Guatemala. And one of the ones that is not so active that you're going to get fried, just a little bit dormant, a little bit hot. It's actually kind of cool. You can go up there, and the ground's so hot in some places, like you can roast your marshmallows if you want, or cook your food. And because that's just the way it is. Cool volcano. Who would, we don't get to do that very often. But it's quite a trek going up. And the Canadians, unlike the Guatemalans, were not always in the best shape. Some of us from our team, probably you would say we weren't physical specimens. Some of us in the team were, maybe well over 300 pounds, and won't go beyond where that could be, but some pretty significant individuals. And going up a mountain with fairly treacherous pass when you're not physically capable is not a good thing to do, particularly with your foreign places. You don't want heart attacks and all that type of stuff. And so some very enterprising individuals realize that there are tourists that come, and Americans and Canadians, many of them are out of shape, and it's a long grind going up there. So there's a bunch of donkeys at the bottom with people, little boys often with their donkeys, and you could pay to have a donkey take you up. And I couldn't believe, that was probably my first experience with donkeys. They're little things, you could almost step over them and have your legs touch, these small little things. And I just was amazed at these donkeys, where these large North Americans draping themselves on the donkey. It's like, man, I couldn't carry this person up. And the donkey just trucks along up these incredible mountain passes all the way to the top. And why do I say all of that? When donkeys have a mind to go someplace, they can go almost anywhere. Nothing's really going to stop them. I mean, if they can take a 300 plus person up a really treacherous pass, Imagine what they could do by themselves. They could go anywhere, do anything. So these donkeys decided to just leave, and Saul and the servant went out and looked for them for 3 days. And they couldn't find them. Went up to the hill country, went all around, couldn't find them. And finally, Saul says, when they reached the district of Zuph, pretty important. In fact, 1 Samuel starts in the area of Zuph. It's the very first words it talks about. So we're getting back to some really, what's God up to? He's brought the entire story back to the exact same spot. And Saul says, let's go. Come, let's go back to my father. He's going to start worrying about the donkeys and start worrying about us. And the servant replied, in the town, there's a man of God, highly respected, and everything he says come true. Let's go there. And that man of God just happened to be a fellow by the name of Samuel. And the place of Zuph just happened to be the place of Ramah, which was Samuel's hometown. And so, verse 7, Saul said to his servant, if we go, what can we give the man? And the food in our sacks is gone. We have no gift to take to the man of God. And the servant says, I got some silver. So look at what Saul has contributed so far. This young, incredibly natural ability young man. He couldn't find donkeys. He couldn't come up with a plan to find the donkeys. And it's the servant who seems to have the more initiative. We don't want to harp too much on this, but I think it's worth noting that it's this servant who gives the right idea. And finally Saul says, okay, let's go. Come, let us go see the seer. And by the way, the seer normally is this individual called the prophet. So verse 10, good, Saul said, let's go. So they went out. And as they were going up to the hill to the town, they met some girls coming out to draw water. And they asked him, is the seer here? And listen to what the girls say. Yes, he is. He's ahead of you. Hurry now. He's just come to our town today. There's going to be a sacrifice. There's going to be a feast. And there's going to be some special guests who are going to be invited, who are going to go up and eat with this seer at this time of this great festival. There's something special happening. One of the things I love about stories is that it doesn't just give us we now get a flashback. Not just the story of Saul and the donkeys, but now we get the inside scoop about what God is doing and what God is doing with Samuel. And as they were going up to the town, it says in verse 15, as they were entering it, there was Samuel coming down the other side. And here's the reason why. Verse 14 or verse 15. The day before Saul came, the Lord revealed to Samuel, about this time tomorrow, I'm going to send you a young man from Benjamin, and you're going to anoint him leader over my people Israel. He will deliver my people from the hand of the Philistines. I have looked upon my people, for their cry has reached me. And I love these words for a number of different reasons, but here it is. God told Samuel that there is going to be a young man from Benjamin who I have sent you, who's going to be anointed the leader of Israel, because I've heard the cry of my people. When I hear that, and number one, I'm just amazed about God's sovereignty and power, God's answer of prayer. But when we combine Saul's experience with Samuel's experience and the interpretation of the events that are taking place, we have totally wildly different things. Saul in his life says, these stupid donkeys have disappeared and I can't find them. This servant is kind of nagging me to go meet this man of God, even though I just want to get back home and I'm concerned about it. And that's Saul's experience. Samuel's, in God's interpretation, is, I did all of these things to send this young man to Samuel. There are times in our lives when our donkeys disappear. Do you know that's one of the way that God works? In January, I'm going to be running a course we postponed. It was supposed to start this week, but a few of you wanted to participate but couldn't right now. So in January, we're going to begin again. It's called Living in 3D, and part of it is discernment and discerning how God speaks to us and talks to us. And what we learn from in this passage right here is that how sometimes God guides our lives is when the donkeys disappear. We got to find them. The frustrations in life, the times, now this isn't in all situations, in all circumstances, but the times when you lose your keys, the times when stuff gets stolen, the times when you lose, the times when you're frustrated, the times that frazzle you, even those experiences can be part of God's plan for your life. In fact, it might be just His purpose to interrupt your life so that you will be exactly where He wants you to be. Maybe that's part of COVID. This whole experience so that some of us would be exactly where God wants us to be, to meet with us and speak with us. Part two of that is sometimes we also need the servants in our lives or people around us, and maybe some of their advice could be wise. Sometimes we may find it inconvenient because we want to give up, and they tell us just try a little bit harder, try a little bit more. And so sometimes God prompts us and directs us by the people that are shaped and part of our lives. In any case, that certainly is for Saul. Saul's servant says, let's go. And God says, that servant is doing my will, bringing me right into God's plans. You know what? Some of us need to be those servants. And we forget or unaware that through the encouragement of the people around us, even when they're going through difficult trials, that you may be part of God's plan of leading your friend, your family member into a place where God will speak to them. So as we move on, and we go to verse 17. When Samuel caught sight of Saul, the Lord said to him, this is the man I spoke to you about. He will govern my people. And so Saul approaches Samuel and says, would you please tell me where the seer's house is? So here's the young man, 3 days of frustration, sort of last-ditch attempt, going up to Ramah, the place, and just on a whim, maybe a prayer, but probably not even. First person he encounters, where's the seer? No idea that God has him exactly where he wants. And Samuel says, I am the seer, or the prophet. Go up ahead of me to the high place. Today you will eat with me. Remember, there was going to be this sacrifice of invited guests? Well, you're one of them. You're going to eat with me. And in the morning, I'm going to let you go and tell you what's all in your heart. I'm going to reveal yourself to you. And as for the donkeys you lost 3 days ago, don't worry about them. They've been found. And to whom is all the desire of Israel turned? If not to you and your father's family. And how could that possibly be true? It's true because God's revealed it as such. It's true because God was going to change all of Israel to believe this again. It's true even though Saul would have doubted those words so greatly. All of Israel turned to Benjamin, this tribe that was a traitor in Israel and almost decimated. The tribe that caused a civil war, the tribe that was almost wiped out, they're going to be the place of the tribe that was humbled. It's going to be great in all of Israel. Imagine Saul's emotion at that particular time in this God moment when God spoke, and I realize this is his story and not our experience, and we just can't teleport. But I love the fact that God could speak to a young man, 28, 29 years old, and totally blow him out of the water, reveal truths that only Saul and God would know, and change his perspective in this world. that instead of the fact that you are going to be a nothing, a one who has cursed your entire life, who's going to be inferior, walking with your shoulders stooped because you are a Benjamite, God's going to turn your history and turn the perspective of others, and you are going to be one who the whole nation will look to. And by the way, your donkeys are okay too. There'd have to have been chills running down Saul's body. And what took place? They went up to the high place. They went to the hall, verse 22, and just imagine Saul, young man. He was seated at the head of those who were invited, about 30 in number. Samuel said, "Bring out the piece of meat I gave you, and the one I took you to lay aside." And so the cook took up the leg, which was on it, set in front of Samuel. And Samuel said, "Here it is. It's been kept aside for you. Eat it. This whole occasion is because of you. I've invited guests to celebrate you." And Saul dined with Samuel that day. And as he was there, it's like, this can't be true. Eyes wide open. This is absolutely impossible. I can't believe this. Why would anybody show me favor because I'm a Benjamite and my family has failed and there's a curse on my name and of my lineage? And as they came down from the high place, Samuel talked with Saul on the roof. Saul fell asleep up there, and at daybreak, verse 26, Samuel called to Saul on the roof, "Get ready, and I will send you on your way." And when Samuel got ready, he and Samuel went outside. And as they were going together, and as they were going down to the edge of the town, Samuel said to Saul, "Tell the servant, go ahead of us." The servant did so. "But you stay, because I have a message for you from God." And Samuel took a flask, poured oil on Saul's head, kissed him, and said, "Has not the Lord anointed you leader over his inheritance?" And Saul, as a young man, would have said, "No way. Don't you know my past? Don't you know my weakness? My dad's a great guy, but I have never done anything great. I see his power, I see his authority, but I haven't been able to fill that out. I haven't been able to live up to his expectations for my life. How can I live up to expectations of God's life? My entire people have shown their weakness. How can I become a leader? How can I fulfill God's call that he asks of me?" And God knew those concerns. In fact, God knows your concerns. Because there could be a call on your life, and you'll say, "Not me, God. Certainly you're mistaken." There can be plans that God has for you that could challenge you, and you make excuses. People all throughout history have done so. "Lord, what about my family? What about who I am? What about my failures? I haven't even been able to be faithful and live up to my parents, let alone your plans. Certainly there's somebody else. Certainly there's somebody else." And it is true that God could raise up somebody else, but it's also true that he may have a plan for you. Just you. In spite of the past, in spite of failures. Because look what he does to Saul. He knows the struggle we have. And so Samuel says to Saul, "When you leave me today, you will meet two men near Rachel's tomb at Zelzah on the border of Benjamin. Then they will say to you, 'The donkeys you set out to look for have been found, and now your father has stopped thinking about them and is worried about you.' Then you will go from there to the great tree of Tabor, and 3 men going up to God at Bethel will meet you there. One will be carrying 3 young goats, another 3 loaves of bread, another a skin of wine, and they will greet you and offer 2 loaves of bread. After that, you're going to go to Gibeah of God, and there is a Philistine outpost. As you approach the town, you will meet a procession of prophets coming down from the high place. They're going to have musical instruments and prophesying, and the Spirit of the Lord will come upon you and in power, and you will prophesy with them, and you will be changed into a different person. And once these signs are fulfilled, whatever you find your hands to do, for God is with you. Go ahead of me in Gilgal, and I'm going to have a sacrifice there. And eventually, all those things came true. And eventually, Samuel came and had the sacrifice and called all Israel together and said, the king is here. God is anointing a king this day, and Israel would have been excited. And we end up with, in chapter 10, all the people are summoned, verse 17. The God who delivers you is now raising up a king. Then he brought forth, verse 21, clan by clan, and Benjamin was chosen. Matri's clan was chosen. Finally, Saul, son of Kish, was chosen. And when they couldn't find him, they said, where is he? And there he was amongst the baggage, hiding, this young man who knew what was going to happen. You know what's funny about that? You know who carries the baggage? The donkeys. Maybe Saul made friends finally with the donkeys. I don't know. But bottom line is, this was a calling that Saul didn't want. He didn't have the courage or the capacity to be able to say, this is who I needed to be. But as they brought Saul out, and as his appearance was radiant, it said the most attractive man in the entire world, or of all of Israel. The Lord's chosen, verse 24. He was taller than all of the others. He had all the natural characteristics of a potential great leader, even though he did not receive it and accept it himself. And the people saw it and said, long live the king. And he became king. And the Spirit of God did come upon him. And he did prophesy. And yes, Saul was a flawed character, and we're going to see that in the future. But he did lead, and he did deliver Israel. And God did use him to accomplish some great things. I want to just point out a couple of major, just incredible things from this story. The first is this. Sometimes it's very hard to accept our natural abilities. It really is. It's so easy at times to see the talents of others and the strengths that other people can have instead of accept the talents that we have. Here was Saul, attractive, tall, a person that could inspire hope and confidence in others, potentially a great military warrior, but he didn't see that about himself. And you say, well, how is that possible? How could somebody who's naturally talented not see that and accept that? You know, sometimes we don't want attention. Sometimes we don't want to step out. Myself personally, I lived amongst the land of the giants. My background as a Vanderker comes from a place in Holland, and literally the place, the Frisians that my descendants are, they're the tallest people in the world. And so I've lived with giants. As a young child, whenever I went to my family reunions, I felt so small and insignificant. But I have heard giants talk, meaning my grandfather and aunts and cousins and uncle. And you know what I found surprising? It just blew my mind. And maybe they were just being nice to me. It's like, oh, here's the little runt of the family, because I'm the runt by far of everybody. Oh, here's the little runt of the family, let's be nice to him. But when I've heard giants talk, meaning I've heard them say that they don't like being tall. They don't like being looked at always and treated different. They don't like the fact that they can't go to a store and buy clothes. They can't go to a shoe store and buy shoes. They're always looking for that which is a special rack and things like that. It's hard to be tall. I've been there with my father, who's much taller than me. And, every place he goes, people look at him just because he's tall. It's very easy and helpful for me when I ever needed to find him. He just, there he is. He always sticks out in a crowd. It's great for me. Sometimes it was hard for him, and it's hard for tall people. They don't want to be asked, how's the weather up there all the time? They don't want to have to walk in an elevator and always be this imposing presence naturally. But that's how they're seen. Everybody else might see that. But it's hard to live that. You can have natural abilities and be so insecure that they're almost a curse to you. They're almost a millstone around your neck. It's hard to live with it. It's hard to imagine, but it's true. It is true. Because most of us have a heart, it's easier to see the flaws in our lives than to accept the strengths that God has given to us and live out our strengths. Accept our natural abilities. But the reality is our natural abilities aren't enough. And for some of us, the only way that we're going to receive and embrace the calling that God has for us, which is maybe point 2, that the call that God gives to us is not just about our own lives. This is not a story about Saul, although it is. It thrills me, it gives me goosebumps thinking, wow, isn't that incredible how God just meets and raises up this young man and just this prophetic voice saying, this is going to happen to you, this is going to happen to you, you're going to have guys who are going to give you bread, oh, by the way, I was waiting for you. It's just like, wow, God, you are in such control that even the details you can change about a people's lives. Maybe that can take place in my life, maybe that will happen in your life, but it's about God's plan. And God's plan and call wasn't for Saul to be a great man. It was because God's people needed a great man. See the difference? It wasn't that God called Saul because God wanted Saul to be great. He said, I've heard the cry of my people. And the purpose of your life and the call in your life isn't for your glory. It's not for your edification, although it may include some of those things. But the way that God wants to inspire your natural abilities and the person he's created you to be is that you would be just one of the individuals who would answer the prayers of his people. There are people in this world who are broken, who are praying to God that God would give them answers, God would give them food, God would give them a word of encouragement, God would give them somebody to be there with them. And sometimes they're praying and sometimes they're not. There's the people of God who are praying and looking to him for hope. And God says, will you be that person for me? Not for all people, but the ones I've placed in your life. Will you accept the call that he has for you? Not be ashamed about your gifts and talents and who you are. But how do we get past our past? You know, a whole sermon should probably go into these next things. Maybe I'll do in the future. But this morning, as I was so blown away by what God did from Samuel to Saul to help Saul be restored. Because remember the 3 things, you probably don't remember, but there were 3 things that Samuel said, go to Rachel's tomb, go to the Oak of Tabor, and you're going to meet people going up to Bethel, and then go to Gibeon, where there's a Philistine outposts. And in the tribe and clan of the Benjamites, those were the 3 most important places of their people. The tomb of Rachel, that's where it all began. That's where their identity started. That's where Benjamin was born and came into this world. And as he came into this world, his mother, Rachel, died and passed away. And so the tomb of Rachel was both a blessing and a curse, that place of incredible formation. It was the place where his mother in birth said, this is the son of my trouble. But his father said, no, this is the son of my right hand. I'm going to call him Benjamin. And that's what it means. And so God brought Saul to that place of identity and formation in this very complicated place of Rachel's tomb that was both their origin, a place of pain, but also a place of blessing. And God remembered him there. You will meet a man who will say, your father is no longer worried about the donkeys, they've been found, and is now worried about you. You are one who is loved. You are one who was cared for. You have an identity that was formed unique and special. And your Father loves you. Second point. Then God brought him to a place of hope. A place of hope, because it was the Oak of Tabor, and there were people going up there, going up to Bethel. And in that location of the Mount of Tabor, that was the place where after Benjamin was broken because of their sins, the nation of Israel cried out to God and interceded on their behalf so that Benjamin would be saved and restored, and that their nation would not be taken away. So after their greatest defeat, God brought them to Tabor as a symbol that hope will begin. In fact, to remind him that in spite of his brokenness, there have been people who have loved and shown mercy to him. This was the place where there was restoration, a place that even after the greatest defeat and failure, there was still those who loved and cared for them. And what better symbol than these three individuals carrying wine and bread, symbols potentially even of communion. And of the 3 loaves, 2 were given to Saul. You will be provided for. You will be provided for. Remember your identity. Remember, even in the midst of brokenness, there's going to be hope. You're going to be provided for. And the final place that God took him to was a place called Gibeon, which was their greatest failure. For it was at Gibeah that the great sin took place. It was the Gibeonites that the Benjamites had defended. It was the Gibeonites that brought the tribe of Benjamin to absolute ruin. It symbolized their failure, their sinfulness, their rebellion, and their selfishness. And God said, I want you to go back there. And there you will meet prophets who are going to allow you, instead of seeing that as a place of failure any longer, experience the grace, experience healing and transformation. And instead of you rebelling against God, God's Spirit will come and transform you and fill you with the spirit of prophecy and the spirit of life. For the calling we have cannot be done on our own. The courage we need can't be as we are burdened by our failures. We must go back there and experience God's renewal and grace to set us free so that we would live by the Spirit. I believe all of you have a calling. I believe all of you have been given natural abilities that maybe the whole world can see, but you have not experienced and received for yourself. And maybe you play with it a bit. But sometimes we see ourselves based on our failures and based on our defeats, and perhaps comparing ourselves to family members or others that have chosen not to believe in us. I believe that Saul's story can be our story. Yes, he had failures. Yes, he did not become perfect in all ways. But he did a lot for the people of God. He got to experience spirit and hope and dreams that he wasn't even looking for. And God's people are still praying and are still hoping. And there are those who are not even God's children yet, who are still looking. And so God is still raising up young men, young women, old women, middle-aged, to respond and to hear and to be changed in the process by the power of the Spirit. God bless you. So Lord, I thank you for these words. I know, God, even that there's going to be some who would hear these who have a hard time. It's so easy to believe, Lord, that you can use others. It's so easy to believe that you can change others. It's so easy to believe sometimes that you are God of this world, ruler of all. Yet for many of us, it's so much harder to believe that you love me and you can change me, and that there's a call on my life where my natural abilities and my failures maybe not are erased, but are transformed. And the strengths that you have given to me are unleashed. And so I pray that your story and the plans for our lives would become our plans, and that we would participate. Maybe it's just being the servant to encourage somebody else and saying, maybe you need to try one more time. Whatever role you have for us, may we say yes. Amen. God bless you.